Lemuria, the sunken paradise that science once demanded and mysticism later devoured. A continent that was born not from ancient legend, not from mythological tradition, but from the cold, rational mind of Victorian zoology. It began as a footnote in a scientific paper about lemurs. It ended as a psychic homeland for a vanished master race, a spiritual Atlantis of the Indian Ocean, a civilization of telepaths who supposedly walked the earth before recorded time. And between those 2 points, between the careful hypothesis and the wild fantasy, lies one of the strangest stories in the entire history of human thought. This is the story of Lemuria. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. There is an ocean that stretches between Africa and Asia. It is vast, warm, ancient, and full of secrets. The Indian Ocean covers roughly 70 million square kilometers of the planet's surface. Its waters move in great seasonal rhythms driven by monsoon winds. Its floor is scarred with ridges and fractures that speak of unimaginable geological violence stretching back hundreds of millions of years. And beneath those waters, beneath the silt and the basalt and the slowly shifting plates of the Earth's crust, there is something conspicuous by its absence. There is no continent. But there was a time, and this time was not in some dark age of superstition, not in some forgotten era of primitive thinking. There was a time within the modern scientific age when serious, respected, credentialed men of science believed with firm conviction that a continent had once existed in the Indian Ocean, that it had connected lands now separated by thousands of kilometers of open water, that it had served as a bridge, a literal, physical, geological bridge, between places that shared animals and plants that had no earthly business being found in both locations. And these men were not fools, they were not cranks, they were some of the finest minds of the 19th century. They looked at the evidence before them, they applied the best scientific reasoning available in their era, and they concluded that a continent must have existed and must have sunk beneath the waves. They called it Lemuria. To understand how this happened, to truly grasp why the idea of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean was once not just plausible but scientifically compelling, you have to go back to the middle of the 19th century. You have to go back to a time when the theory of evolution was brand new, when the science of geology was still wrestling with enormous questions about how the Earth had formed and changed over time, and when the distribution of animals across the globe presented puzzles that seemed utterly insoluble without invoking dramatic geographical changes. The year was 1859. Charles Darwin had just published On the Origin of Species. The book shook the foundations of Western thought. It proposed that species were not fixed, immutable creations, but rather the products of long, slow change driven by natural selection. Every living thing was connected to every other living thing through vast genealogies stretching back millions of years. Species adapted to their environments, they changed, they diverged, they went extinct, and new species arose from old ones through the accumulation of small variations over immense spans of time. This was revolutionary, this was world-altering. But it immediately raised a question that Darwin himself struggled with and that his contemporaries found deeply troubling. If species evolved gradually, changing slowly over millions of years, then closely related species should be found in places that are geographically close to one another. A species in one location should give rise to similar species in nearby locations. The further apart two places are, the more different their animals and plants should be. This made intuitive sense. This seemed logical, but the natural world refused to cooperate with this neat expectation. Across the globe, naturalists were finding patterns of animal and plant distribution that made no sense if the continents had always been in their current positions. There were marsupials in both South America and Australia, but nowhere in between. There were similar freshwater fish in Africa and South America, oceans apart. There were plant families shared between India and Madagascar, separated by thousands of kilometers of open Indian Ocean. and there were lemurs, small, wide-eyed, long-tailed primates, creatures of the night mostly, with grasping hands and soft fur, and an evolutionary lineage that stretched back to the earliest days of primate evolution. Lemurs were fascinating animals. They were primitive in many respects, retaining features that more advanced primates, monkeys, apes, humans had long since lost or modified. They were, in a sense, living fossils, windows into what the earliest primates might have looked like tens of millions of years ago. And they presented a geographical mystery that was, in the 1860s, utterly baffling. Lemurs, or animals very closely related to lemurs, were found in Madagascar, the great island off the southeastern coast of Africa. This was where the vast majority of lemur species lived. Madagascar was lemur paradise, lemur homeland, lemur central. Dozens of species, from the tiny mouse lemur to the large indri, had evolved on this island in splendid isolation, but lemur relatives were also found in India and in Southeast Asia, and fossil lemurs, or animals that appeared to be ancestral to lemurs, were found in parts of Africa and even in Europe. The living lemurs and their close relatives, the lorises, were scattered across a vast geographical area that included Madagascar, the Indian subcontinent, and parts of Southeast Asia. They were separated by the immense expanse of the Indian Ocean. There was no obvious way for them to have crossed that ocean. They were not ocean-going animals. They could not fly. They could not swim thousands of kilometers. They were small terrestrial or arboreal creatures that lived in forests and could not possibly have rafted across open ocean on floating vegetation, or so it seemed at the time. How then had they gotten to all of these places? How could closely related animals exist on landmasses separated by one of the world's great oceans? This was the puzzle. This was the question that haunted the naturalists of the 1860s. And it was into this question that a man named Philip Lutley Sclater stepped, armed with a hypothesis that would change the course of intellectual history in ways he could never have imagined. Philip Sclater was an English zoologist. Born in 1829, he was a man of the Victorian scientific establishment, well-educated, well-connected, methodical, and precise. He was a specialist in ornithology, the study of birds, and he was also deeply interested in the broader question of biogeography, the science of why animals live where they live. He was secretary of the Zoological Society of London, a position of considerable prestige. He was exactly the kind of serious, establishment scientist whose ideas would be taken seriously by the scientific community. In 1864, Sclater published a paper that would make his name immortal, though not quite in the way he might have wished. The paper was titled The Mammals of Madagascar. In it, Sclater examined the peculiar distribution of mammals on the island of Madagascar and on the Indian subcontinent. He focused particularly on the lemurs and their relatives. He noted the remarkable similarities between species found in Madagascar and species found in India and Southeast Asia. He considered the vast ocean that separated these landmasses, and he concluded that there was only one reasonable explanation. There must have once been a land connection. A continent now sunken beneath the Indian Ocean must have once bridged the gap between Madagascar and India. Animals had walked across this land bridge. They had spread from one end to the other. Then the land had sunk. The ocean had flooded in. The animals were stranded on the remaining fragments, Madagascar on one side, India on the other, and had evolved separately ever since. Sclater called this hypothetical sunken continent Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution had led him to propose it. Now it is crucial to understand that Sclater's proposal was not wild speculation. It was not pseudoscience. It was not the product of an overactive imagination or a desire to create sensational stories. It was, by the standards of 1864, a perfectly reasonable scientific hypothesis. Sclater was working within the accepted geological framework of his time, and that framework allowed for, indeed, expected the rising and sinking of large land areas over geological time. This framework was called uniformitarianism, but it operated within a model of the Earth that was fundamentally different from the one we have today. In the mid-19th century, the dominant theory of how the Earth's surface changed was the contraction theory. This theory held that the Earth had originally been a molten ball of rock. As it cooled over millions of years, it contracted, it shrank. As it shrank, its outer surface wrinkled and folded, like the skin of a drying apple. These wrinkles produced mountains and valleys, raised lands and sunken basins. And crucially, this process could cause large areas of land to sink below sea level, just as it could cause other areas to rise above it. Under this theory, continents could sink. It was not just possible, it was expected. The Earth was cooling, contracting, wrinkling, and rearranging its surface features in an ongoing process of geological change. A continent that existed millions of years ago could, through the slow contraction of the Earth, gradually sink beneath the ocean. This was mainstream geology. This was what the textbooks said. This was what professors taught in universities. And within this framework, proposing a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean to explain the distribution of lemurs was no more outlandish than proposing that a mountain range had been pushed up by the same forces. Sclater's hypothesis was received with interest and in many quarters with approval. The idea of Lemuria filled a gap. It solved a problem. It explained something that otherwise seemed inexplicable. And it was soon picked up and expanded by other scientists who found it useful for explaining their own puzzling observations. The most important of these scientists was Ernst Haeckel. If Sclater was the father of Lemuria, Haeckel was its most enthusiastic promoter, the man who took the idea and ran with it further than Sclater had ever intended. Ernst Heinrich Philipp August Haeckel was a German biologist, naturalist, philosopher, and artist. Born in 1834, he was one of the most famous scientists of the 19th century and one of the most controversial. He was a passionate advocate of Darwin's theory of evolution. He popularized evolutionary ideas in Germany and across Europe through his books, lectures, and stunning illustrations of natural forms. He coined numerous scientific terms that are still used today, including ecology, phylum, and stem cell. He was brilliant, prolific, combative, and frequently wrong about important details, but he was never boring. Haeckel was deeply interested in human evolution. He was one of the first scientists to seriously attempt to trace the evolutionary history of the human species, constructing elaborate genealogical trees that showed how humans had descended from earlier primates, which had descended from earlier mammals, which had descended from reptiles, and so on back through the vast depths of time. He was a pioneer in this field, working at a time when almost no hominin fossils had been found, and when the idea that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors was still deeply controversial. And Haeckel had a problem. The problem was simple but profound. If humans had evolved from earlier primates, then there should be fossil evidence of the intermediate stages, the missing links between apes and humans. But in the 1860s and 70s, almost no such fossils had been found. Where were they? Why had they not been discovered? Haeckel had an answer, and that answer was Lemuria. In his 1870 book, The History of Creation, Haeckel proposed that the earliest humans, or rather the immediate ancestors of humans, the transitional forms between apes and humans, had evolved not in Africa, not in Asia, and not in Europe, but on the now sunken continent of Lemuria. He argued that Lemuria had been the cradle of humanity. The first proto-humans had walked on Lemurian soil, had evolved on Lemurian landscapes, and when Lemuria sank beneath the Indian Ocean, their fossils had sunk with it, lost forever beneath the waves. This was why the missing links could not be found, Haeckel argued. They were at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, buried under millions of years of marine sediment, utterly beyond the reach of any paleontologist. The absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. The fossils existed, they just existed in a place where no human could ever dig them up. Haeckel went further. He proposed that from Lemuria, early humans had migrated outward in all directions before the continent sank. Some had gone east to Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Some had gone west to Africa. Some had gone north to India and beyond. This dispersal from a central Lemurian homeland explained the distribution of different human races across the globe. It explained why certain features were shared between peoples separated by vast distances. It was a grand, sweeping theory of human origins that placed a sunken continent at the very center of the human story. Haeckel even gave a name to the hypothetical ancestor who had evolved on Lemuria. He called it Pithecanthropus alalis, the speechless ape man. This creature Haeckel believed was the true missing link, the bridge between apes and humans, and its bones lay at the bottom of the Indian Ocean along with the drowned continent that had been its home. It is worth pausing here to note something remarkable. Haeckel's hypothesis about Lemuria as the cradle of humanity was wrong. Completely, utterly, fundamentally wrong. Humans evolved in Africa. The fossil evidence for this is now overwhelming and irrefutable. The missing links that Haeckel sought on the ocean floor were waiting to be found in the rift valleys and savannas of eastern and southern Africa, where they would be discovered over the following century and a half. Lemuria had nothing to do with human evolution, but Haeckel was wrong for the right reasons. He was working with incomplete data. He was applying reasonable logic to an inadequate evidence base. He was trying to solve a genuine problem, the absence of transitional hominin fossils, with the tools and knowledge available to him. The fact that his answer was wrong does not diminish the legitimacy of his question, and his theory, wrong as it was, had enormous influence. It put Lemuria on the map, literally. Haeckel published maps showing the location of the sunken continent, positioned squarely in the Indian Ocean, stretching from Madagascar to India and perhaps beyond. These maps were reproduced in textbooks and popular science books. They were seen by millions of people, and they planted the idea of Lemuria firmly in the public imagination. But Sclater and Haeckel were not alone. The idea of sunken continents and land bridges was, in the latter half of the 19th century, one of the most active areas of scientific speculation. Geologists and naturalists around the world were grappling with the same fundamental problem, the inexplicable distribution of plants and animals across landmasses separated by vast oceans, and many of them were reaching similar conclusions. If the animals could not have crossed the oceans, then the oceans must not always have been there. Land bridges, sunken continents, and former land connections were proposed for almost every ocean on Earth. In addition to Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, scientists proposed Gondwanaland, a vast southern supercontinent that had once connected South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. This proposal, made by the Austrian geologist Eduard Suess in the 1880s, was based on the remarkable similarities in fossil plants, particularly a genus called Glossopteris, found on all of these southern landmasses. Suess did not propose that these continents had moved. He proposed that they had once been connected by land bridges that had since sunk beneath the oceans. There were other proposals as well. A land bridge across the Atlantic, connecting Africa and South America, was suggested to explain the similarities in their freshwater fish and other animals. A land bridge across the North Atlantic, sometimes called Thule, was proposed to explain the distribution of plants and animals between Europe and northern regions. Land bridges were proposed between Asia and North America, which in fact did exist at various times in the form of Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge. The scientific literature of the late 19th century was thick with proposed sunken lands and vanished continents, and not all of these ideas were wrong. Some of them contained kernels of truth that would eventually be confirmed by plate tectonics. The southern continents really had once been connected, not by land bridges that sank, but by the continents themselves having been joined together in the supercontinent of Gondwana, which broke apart as the continents drifted away from each other. The similarities in fossils were real. The geological connections were real. But the mechanism, sinking land bridges versus moving continents, was completely wrong. However, in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, nobody knew about plate tectonics. Nobody knew that continents could move. The idea that the solid, massive continents could drift across the surface of the Earth like ships on a very slow ocean would not be seriously proposed until 1912, when Alfred Wegener published his theory of continental drift. And even then, Wegener's theory would be rejected by the geological establishment for another 50 years, not finding general acceptance until the 1960s. So Lemuria flourished. It flourished because the science of the day demanded it. It flourished because the puzzles it was designed to solve were real puzzles, and no better solution was available. And it flourished because it captured the imagination, not just of scientists, but of the general public, and crucially, of certain individuals who would take the idea of a sunken continent and transform it into something that Philip Sclater and Ernst Haeckel would never have recognized. To understand the transformation of Lemuria from a scientific hypothesis into a mystical legend, you have to understand the intellectual climate of the late 19th century. This was a time of extraordinary ferment. Science was advancing at a breathtaking pace. Evolution, geology, archaeology, anthropology, all of these fields were revealing a past that was far older, far stranger, and far more complex than anyone had previously imagined. The Earth was millions of years old. Humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors. Ancient civilizations had risen and fallen long before the earliest recorded histories. The universe was far larger and far older than the Bible had suggested. For many people, these discoveries were thrilling. For others, they were deeply unsettling. The old certainties were crumbling. The religious worldview that had provided meaning and structure for centuries was being challenged at every turn. And in the gap between the old certainties and the new scientific understanding, a vast space opened up, a space that was quickly filled by new movements, new philosophies, and new spiritual systems that attempted to reconcile the ancient with the modern, the scientific with the spiritual, the material with the mystical. One of the most important of these movements was Theosophy. The Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 in New York City by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Henry Steele Olcott, and William Quan Judge. Of these three founders, it was Blavatsky, universally known as Madame Blavatsky, or simply HPB, who was the driving intellectual force, the visionary, the prophet, and the most controversial figure. Helena Blavatsky was born in 1831 in Yekaterinoslav, in the Russian Empire, to an aristocratic family. She was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary women of the 19th century and one of the most polarizing. To her followers, she was a spiritual genius, a woman of vast learning and profound mystical insight who had been chosen by hidden masters, the Mahatmas, to bring ancient wisdom to the modern world. To her critics, she was a fraud, a charlatan, a plagiarist, and a fantasist who cobbled together a mishmash of Eastern and Western esoteric traditions, dressed them up in pseudo-scientific language, and presented them as revealed truth. The truth, as is usually the case, was more complex than either side admitted. Blavatsky was genuinely learned in her fashion. She had read widely in both Western and Eastern philosophical and religious traditions. She had a remarkable ability to synthesize disparate ideas into a coherent, or at least internally consistent, worldview. She was charismatic, forceful, and utterly convinced of the truth of her own teachings, and she was not above fabricating evidence when she felt it was necessary to convince skeptics, a trait that would later bring her considerable trouble. Blavatsky's great work, her magnum opus, was a book called The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888. It was an enormous work, running to 2 thick volumes, and it laid out Blavatsky's vision of the history of the cosmos, the earth, and the human race. It was dense, difficult, sometimes impenetrable, and filled with references to obscure texts, ancient traditions, and modern scientific theories. And at its heart, it contained a history of humanity that was unlike anything that had ever been proposed before, or arguably since. According to The Secret Doctrine, the history of humanity was not a simple linear progression from primitive ape men to modern civilization. It was instead a vast cyclical process involving 7 root races, 7 great stages of human evolution, each associated with a different continent, a different physical form, and a different level of spiritual development. The first root race, according to Blavatsky, had been ethereal, almost non-physical beings who had inhabited an imperishable sacred land, a continent at the North Pole that had never been destroyed and was somehow beyond the reach of geological change. These beings were not human in any recognizable sense. They were spiritual entities, shadows, forms of consciousness that had not yet taken on physical bodies. The second root race had inhabited a continent called Hyperborea, located in the far north, around what is now the Arctic. These beings were slightly more physical than the first root race, but still largely non-corporeal. They reproduced by budding like plants or simple organisms. They were golden-colored and lived in a warm climate. The Arctic, Blavatsky claimed, had once been tropical. The third root race was the Lemurians, and here with the third root race we arrive at the heart of the matter. Here is where Sclater's sober, scientific hypothesis about lemur distribution was transformed into something utterly different, a grand mystical narrative about the spiritual evolution of humanity. According to Blavatsky's secret doctrine, the Lemurians were the third great race of humanity. They had inhabited the continent of Lemuria, the same Lemuria that Sclater had proposed as a sunken landmass in the Indian Ocean, though Blavatsky's Lemuria was far larger and far more dramatic than anything Sclater had imagined. Blavatsky's Lemuria was enormous. It covered much of the southern hemisphere, stretching from what is now the Indian Ocean westward into the Pacific. At its greatest extent, it reached from the foot of the Himalayas southward across the Indian Ocean, incorporating what are now Madagascar, Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and many other islands, and extending eastward to include parts of the Pacific. It was, in Blavatsky's telling, one of the largest continents that had ever existed, a vast tropical landmass that dominated the southern half of the globe. And the beings who inhabited this continent were, to put it mildly, unusual. The earliest Lemurians, according to Blavatsky, were not fully physical. They were transitional beings, halfway between the ethereal second root race and the fully physical humans who would come later. They were enormous giants, perhaps 60 feet tall in some versions of the story, though the exact height varied. They had soft, boneless bodies in their earliest incarnations. They reproduced by laying eggs, yes, eggs, a form of reproduction that Blavatsky claimed was a remnant of their semi-spiritual, semi-physical nature. As the Lemurian epoch progressed, these beings became more and more physical. Their bodies solidified. They developed bones and internal organs. They shrank in size, though they remained much larger than modern humans. And they developed something extraordinary, a third eye. The third eye of the Lemurians was not a metaphor. In Blavatsky's telling, it was a literal physical organ, an eye located in the back of the head that gave the Lemurians psychic abilities. They could perceive spiritual realities. They could communicate telepathically. They could sense things that were invisible to ordinary physical sight. This third eye was the seat of their spiritual power, the organ through which they connected to the higher spiritual realms from which they had descended. Blavatsky connected this to the pineal gland, a small, pine cone-shaped structure deep in the brain that was, even in the 19th century, something of a mystery. René Descartes had famously called the pineal gland the seat of the soul. Modern science had little to say about its function. Blavatsky claimed that the pineal gland was the vestigial remnant of the Lemurians' third eye, that it had once been a fully functional organ of psychic perception, but had atrophied and retreated into the interior of the brain as humanity became more physical and less spiritual over the course of subsequent root races. The Lemurians, according to Blavatsky, were guided by divine beings, spiritual teachers from higher planes of existence who helped them develop their civilization. These divine teachers gave the Lemurians the gift of mind, the spark of self-consciousness that separated them from the purely instinctive beings they had been before. This was a crucial moment in the cosmic history of humanity, according to Theosophy. The lighting of the mind, the moment when the Lemurians received the gift of intelligence, was the true beginning of human civilization, but the Lemurians misused their gifts. As they became more physical, more material, more attached to the pleasures and powers of the physical world, they fell from grace. They turned away from their spiritual teachers. They used their psychic powers for selfish and destructive purposes. They practiced dark arts. They created monstrous hybrids by crossing with animals. They descended into corruption and depravity. and then Lemuria was destroyed. According to Blavatsky, Lemuria was destroyed by fire, by volcanic eruptions on a scale that beggars the imagination. The continent was torn apart by earthquakes and eruptions. It sank beneath the waves of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The vast majority of the Lemurian race perished. Only a few survivors escaped, migrating to lands that remained above sea level, and these survivors became the ancestors of certain modern peoples. Blavatsky claimed that the indigenous peoples of Australia, parts of Africa, and certain Pacific islands were descendants of the Lemurians. She arranged these peoples in a racial hierarchy that placed them below the subsequent root races, the Atlanteans, the fourth root race, and the Aryans, the fifth root race, which included most modern Europeans and Indians. This racial hierarchy was an integral part of Blavatsky's system, and it is one of the most troubling and problematic aspects of theosophical teaching. It assigned different levels of spiritual development to different racial groups, with some groups being more evolved and others being remnants of earlier, more primitive stages of human spiritual evolution. This aspect of Blavatsky's teaching has been rightly criticized by modern scholars and commentators. It provided a pseudo-spiritual justification for racial hierarchy that was deeply harmful and that would later be appropriated by even more extreme ideologies. But in the context of the late 19th century, racial hierarchies were unfortunately widely accepted in both scientific and popular culture. Blavatsky was a product of her time, and her racial theories, while presented in a uniquely mystical framework, reflected the broader prejudices of the Victorian era. But let us step back from the moral dimension for a moment and consider what Blavatsky had actually done. She had taken a scientific hypothesis, Sclater's proposal of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean, and transformed it into the setting for a cosmic drama. She had populated a geological feature with spiritual beings. She had given a landmass a history, a civilization, a purpose in the grand scheme of human evolution. She had taken a piece of sober Victorian science and turned it into myth, and she had done it with extraordinary skill. Whatever one thinks of Blavatsky's claims, and there are very good reasons to be deeply skeptical of most of them, there is no denying her talent as a myth-maker. Her Lemuria was vivid, detailed, and compelling. It had the sweep and grandeur of an epic. It placed humanity's story in a cosmic context that dwarfed anything offered by conventional religion or conventional science. And it answered deep human needs, the need for meaning, for purpose, for a sense that human existence was part of a larger plan. Blavatsky did not invent the idea of Lemuria, but she reinvented it. She took a name and a concept from science and gave it a completely new life. And in doing so, she ensured that Lemuria would outlive its usefulness as a scientific hypothesis by more than a century. Long after geologists had abandoned the idea of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean, Lemuria would live on in the imaginations of millions of people, a testament to the power of myth and the human hunger for lost worlds. Now, Blavatsky was not working in a vacuum. She was drawing on a rich tradition of speculation about lost continents and ancient civilizations that stretched back thousands of years. The most famous of these traditions, of course, was the legend of Atlantis. Atlantis was first described by the Greek philosopher Plato in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. According to Plato, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually identified as the Strait of Gibraltar, that had been destroyed by earthquakes and floods and sunk beneath the sea in a single day and night of catastrophe, roughly 9,000 years before Plato's time. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Plato intended Atlantis as a literal historical account or as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the inevitable fall of civilizations that grow too proud and too powerful. The majority of modern scholars believe it was allegory, but the idea of Atlantis as a real place has never died. It has been one of the most persistent and seductive ideas in Western culture, inspiring countless books, explorations, and theories over the past 2.5 millennia. Blavatsky incorporated Atlantis into her system. In her telling, the Atlanteans were the fourth root race, the race that succeeded the Lemurians and inhabited a continent in the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlanteans were more physically refined than the Lemurians, closer to modern humans in appearance and stature. They had developed a high civilization with advanced technology, not the technology of steam and electricity that characterized the Victorian age, but a different kind of technology, one based on psychic and spiritual forces that modern science could not comprehend. The Atlanteans, like the Lemurians before them, eventually fell from grace. They misused their powers, turned to dark magic, and brought destruction upon themselves. Atlantis was destroyed by floods, the great flood that appeared in the mythologies of countless cultures around the world and sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The survivors fled to other lands, carrying with them fragments of Atlantean knowledge and culture. In Blavatsky's system, Lemuria preceded Atlantis. Lemuria was more ancient, more remote, more alien. It was the continent of the third root race, and it had been destroyed before Atlantis even rose. The Lemurians had been more primitive than the Atlanteans, physically larger, spiritually powerful, but intellectually less developed, closer to the animal kingdom in some respects. They represented an earlier stage of spiritual evolution. Atlantis, which came later, represented a more advanced stage, but one that was still inferior to the fifth root race, the Aryans, who were the current stage of human evolution. This layered history, Lemuria, then Atlantis, then the current age, gave Blavatsky's system a grand temporal sweep. It implied that the history of humanity was far older and far more complex than either science or religion had yet recognized. It suggested that civilizations had risen and fallen multiple times before recorded history even began. And it implied that the modern world was not the pinnacle of human achievement, but merely the latest chapter in an ongoing cosmic story. The influence of Blavatsky's ideas was enormous. The Theosophical Society attracted thousands of members in Europe, India, and elsewhere. Blavatsky's books were widely read and widely discussed. Her ideas penetrated into art, literature, politics, and popular culture. They influenced movements as diverse as the Indian independence movement. Several early Indian nationalists, including Annie Besant, who later became president of the Theosophical Society, were deeply involved in both Theosophy and the struggle for Indian self-rule, and the early 20th century avant-garde art movement, which drew on theosophical ideas about hidden spiritual realities and higher planes of existence. But Blavatsky was only the beginning. After her death in 1891, her ideas were taken up, modified, and expanded by a host of successors, each of whom added their own elements to the Lemurian myth. One of the most important of these successors was William Scott-Elliot, a British theosophist who published two influential books, The Story of Atlantis in 1896 and The Lost Lemuria in 1904. Scott-Elliot claimed to have obtained his information not through conventional research but through clairvoyant investigation, through psychic visions of the past that had been confirmed by the Theosophical Mahatmas, the hidden spiritual masters who guided the Theosophical movement. Scott-Elliot's Lost Lemuria provided far more detail about Lemurian civilization than Blavatsky had offered. He described the physical appearance of the Lemurians in greater detail. They were brown-skinned, he claimed, with flat faces and wide-set eyes. They were about 12 to 15 feet tall. They had a third eye in the back of their heads that functioned as an organ of psychic vision. They could not reason as modern humans do, but they possessed powerful psychic abilities, including clairvoyance and telepathy. Scott-Elliot described Lemurian cities, though he admitted they were crude by later standards, massive structures of stone and volcanic rock, impressive in scale but primitive in design. He described Lemurian religion, a form of nature worship guided by divine teachers. He described Lemurian technology, which was minimal, as the Lemurians relied more on psychic powers than on physical tools. He also published maps of Lemuria at various stages of its existence, showing how the continent had gradually broken apart and sunk over millions of years. These maps showed a vast landmass covering much of the southern hemisphere, stretching from Africa to Australia and from the Indian Ocean into the Pacific. They were beautifully drawn and utterly fictional, but they gave Lemuria a geographical reality, a shape, a size, a location that made it feel more concrete and believable. Scott-Elliot's books were popular within theosophical circles and beyond. They established a standard version of the Lemurian story that would be repeated and elaborated upon for decades to come. And they demonstrated something important about the way myths evolve. Each new telling adds detail, complexity, and color. Each new author builds upon the work of their predecessors, filling in gaps, answering questions, and creating a more elaborate and more compelling narrative. The Lemurian myth, like all myths, grew richer and more detailed with each retelling. Another important figure in the development of the Lemurian myth was Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher, esotericist, and founder of Anthroposophy. Steiner had been a member of the Theosophical Society, but had broken away to found his own movement in 1912. He retained many theosophical ideas, including the concept of root races and the existence of Lemuria, but he modified and reinterpreted them in significant ways. In his book Cosmic Memory, published in 1904, and in numerous lectures throughout his career, Steiner described his own version of Lemurian history. His Lemurians were even more alien and more fascinating than Blavatsky's. According to Steiner, the Lemurians had possessed a willpower that was directly connected to the forces of nature. They could control the growth of plants, the movement of natural forces, and the behavior of animals through sheer force of will. They had no need for technology because they could manipulate the physical world directly through their psychic powers. Steiner described the Lemurian environment as one of intense volcanic activity and extreme heat. The atmosphere was thick with moisture and volcanic gases. The landscape was dominated by vast forests and powerful geological forces. The Lemurians lived in caves and natural shelters, not because they lacked the ability to build, but because their relationship with the natural world was so intimate that artificial structures were unnecessary. Like Blavatsky, Steiner described the fall of the Lemurians as a consequence of the misuse of their powers, but Steiner's version was more nuanced. He argued that the fall was a necessary part of human evolution, that in order for humans to develop individual self-consciousness, they had to descend into matter, to lose their direct connection with the spiritual world, to become more physical and more separate. The fall of the Lemurians was not a punishment but a stage in a cosmic process of spiritual development, a process that would eventually lead humanity back to the spiritual heights, but now with the added gift of individual consciousness and free will. Steiner's ideas were influential in their own right. Anthroposophy inspired the Waldorf school movement, biodynamic agriculture, and various other practical initiatives. And Steiner's version of Lemurian history, while less widely known than Blavatsky's, added another layer to the growing mythology of the lost continent. Meanwhile, something fascinating was happening on the other side of the world in India, and more specifically in the southern part of India, in the Tamil-speaking regions. There, the idea of Lemuria was being adopted and transformed in a completely different direction. Tamil civilization is one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the world. The Tamil language is ancient, with a literary tradition stretching back more than 2,000 years. Tamil culture has a deep sense of its own antiquity and a rich tradition of scholarship, poetry, and philosophy. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Tamil scholars and cultural nationalists discovered Lemuria, and they recognized in it something extraordinary. The Tamil literary tradition contained references to a lost land called Kumari Kandam, a region to the south of the present-day Indian subcontinent that had been submerged by the sea in ancient times. According to Tamil tradition, Kumari Kandam had been a flourishing land where Tamil civilization had thrived. Great cities had stood there, poets had composed there. The earliest Tamil literary academies, the legendary Sangams, had met there, and then the sea had taken it. These traditions were ancient. They predated the Western idea of Lemuria by centuries, if not millennia. But when Tamil scholars encountered Sclater's hypothesis and the theosophical elaborations upon it, they saw a remarkable convergence. Here was Western science and Western mysticism, confirming what Tamil tradition had always known, that there had once been a great land to the south, now beneath the Indian Ocean. Lemuria, they concluded, was Kumari Kandam. The sunken continent of the scientists was the lost homeland of Tamil civilization. This identification of Lemuria with Kumari Kandam became enormously popular in Tamil Nadu. It was championed by scholars, politicians, and cultural leaders. It appeared in textbooks, in speeches, in literature, and in popular culture. It became a source of cultural pride, evidence that Tamil civilization was not merely old but ancient beyond measure, that it had roots stretching back to a time before recorded history, before even the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The connection between Lemuria and Tamil identity was not entirely a product of Western influence. Tamil traditions about Kumari Kandam existed independently of Sclater and Blavatsky. But the Western idea of Lemuria gave these traditions a new scientific-seeming legitimacy. It allowed Tamil scholars to claim that their ancient traditions were being confirmed by modern science, and it provided a powerful narrative of cultural origins that resonated deeply with the Tamil sense of identity and pride. This process, the adoption and adaptation of a Western scientific mystical concept by a non-Western culture for its own purposes, is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Lemuria story. It shows how ideas can travel across cultural boundaries, how they can be transformed by new contexts, and how they can serve very different purposes in different settings. In the West, Lemuria was a scientific hypothesis or a mystical fantasy. In Tamil Nadu, it became a cultural landmark, a symbol of ancient glory, and a source of collective identity. The story of Lemuria's adoption by Tamil culture deserves closer examination, because it reveals something important about the relationship between myth, science, and identity. The Tamil literary tradition speaks of three great sangams, literary academies, that existed in ancient times. According to tradition, the first sangam was held in a city called then Madurai, or southern Madurai, which was located on the land that now lies beneath the sea. This first sangam lasted for an almost impossibly long period, 4,440 years, according to some accounts, and produced a vast body of literature, all of which was lost when the sea consumed the land. The second sangam was held in a city called Kapatapuram, also eventually lost to the sea. The third sangam was held in the present-day city of Madurai in Tamil Nadu, and the literature produced at this sangam, the sangam literature, is the earliest surviving body of Tamil literary works, dating to roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. The tradition of the lost sangams and the lost lands they inhabited was well established in Tamil culture long before anyone in the West thought of Lemuria. The idea that great lands had been lost to the sea was part of the Tamil cultural heritage. So when the Western idea of Lemuria came along, it was received not as a foreign import but as a confirmation of existing knowledge. Tamil scholars and writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries enthusiastically embraced the connection. They argued that Kumari Kandam, the lost Tamil homeland, was identical to Lemuria. They claimed that Tamil civilization had originated on this sunken continent and was therefore far older than any other civilization on Earth. They argued that the Tamil language was the original language of humanity, the mother of all languages, and that it had been spoken on Lemuria before spreading to other lands. Some Tamil writers went further still. They claimed that all human civilization had originated in Lemuria, that the ancient Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Chinese, and all other ancient peoples had received their culture, their knowledge, and their languages from the Lemurian Tamils. This was Tamil cultural nationalism taken to its logical extreme, a claim of civilizational primacy that placed Tamil culture at the very foundation of human history. These claims were, of course, not supported by any credible evidence. There is no archaeological evidence for a Tamil civilization on a sunken continent. There is no linguistic evidence that Tamil is the mother of all languages, and the geological evidence, as we shall see, conclusively disproves the existence of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean. But the power of the idea was not in its evidence. It was in its emotional and cultural resonance. It was in the way it made people feel about their heritage, their language, and their identity. The Kumari Kandam/Lemuria narrative became deeply embedded in Tamil popular culture. It appeared in novels, in films, in political speeches, and in school curricula. Political leaders invoked it to rally support. Cultural organizations promoted it as historical fact. And despite the complete absence of supporting evidence, it remains popular in Tamil Nadu to this day, a testament to the enduring power of lost continent myths and their ability to serve deep psychological and cultural needs. Let us return now to the scientific story, because while Lemuria was being transformed into a mystical homeland and a cultural symbol, the science that had given birth to it was undergoing its own dramatic transformation. Throughout the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, the idea of sunken continents and land bridges remained a fixture of mainstream geology and biology. The distribution of animals and plants across the globe continued to present puzzles that seemed to require former land connections. And the contraction theory of the Earth, the idea that the Earth was cooling and shrinking, causing its surface to wrinkle and fold, continued to provide a mechanism by which continents could sink. But there were problems, there had always been problems, and as the 20th century dawned, these problems became increasingly difficult to ignore. The first problem was isostasy. The concept of isostasy, developed in the mid-19th century and refined in the decades that followed, described the gravitational equilibrium between the Earth's crust and its underlying mantle. The basic idea was simple. The Earth's crust floats on the denser mantle beneath it, much as an iceberg floats on water. Continental crust, which is relatively light and thick, rides high on the mantle, standing above sea level. Oceanic crust, which is denser and thinner, rides lower, forming the ocean floors. The implications of isostasy for the sunken continent hypothesis were devastating. If continental crust floats on the mantle because it is lighter and thicker than oceanic crust, then a continent cannot simply sink. It cannot plunge beneath the ocean any more than a wooden block can sink in water. A continent could be eroded, broken apart, or worn down, but it could not sink through the mantle like a stone through water. The physics simply did not allow it. This was a serious blow to the idea of Lemuria. If isostasy was correct, and increasing evidence suggested it was, then Sclater's sunken continent was physically impossible. A large continental landmass in the Indian Ocean could not have sunk beneath the waves because continental crust does not sink, it floats. But the full implications of isostasy took time to be appreciated. Many geologists continued to believe in sunken continents well into the 20th century, partly because the alternative, that the continents themselves had moved, seemed even more impossible. And this brings us to Alfred Wegener. Alfred Lothar Wegener was a German meteorologist and geophysicist born in 1880 in Berlin. He was not a geologist by training, which was both his greatest advantage and his greatest handicap. His advantage was that he approached the question of continental distribution with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the assumptions and traditions of the geological establishment. His handicap was that the geological establishment did not take kindly to outsiders telling them their business. In 1912, Wegener proposed his theory of continental drift, the idea that the continents had once been joined together in a single supercontinent, which he called Pangaea, and had since drifted apart to their present positions. He pointed to the remarkable fit of the coastlines of Africa and South America, which looked like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had been pulled apart. He pointed to the matching geological formations, fossil species, and rock types found on opposite sides of the Atlantic. He pointed to the distribution of ancient glacial deposits, which made no sense if the continents had always been in their current positions, but made perfect sense if the southern continents had once been clustered together near the South Pole. Wegener's theory explained everything that sunken continents and land bridges had been invoked to explain, but it explained them far more elegantly and without requiring continents to perform the physically impossible feat of sinking through the mantle. The lemurs of Madagascar and India were not connected by a sunken land bridge. Instead, Madagascar and India had once been part of the same landmass, Gondwana, and had drifted apart. The lemurs had not crossed an ocean. The ocean had formed between them. It was brilliant, it was elegant, it was almost certainly correct, and it was rejected. The geological establishment savaged Wegener's theory. They attacked his evidence, his methods, his credentials, and his motives. They pointed out correctly that Wegener could not explain the mechanism by which continents moved. What force could possibly push a continent across the surface of the Earth? Wegener suggested that the continents plowed through the oceanic crust like ships through ice, but calculations showed that no known force was strong enough to do this. Without a mechanism, the theory was just speculation, the geologists argued. It was ingenious, perhaps, but it was not science. Wegener died in 1930 on an expedition to the Greenland ice sheet, still largely rejected by the scientific establishment. His theory of continental drift lay in limbo for decades, not entirely forgotten, but not accepted either. It was kept alive by a handful of supporters, mostly in the southern hemisphere, where the evidence for former continental connections was most compelling. But in the great universities and research institutions of the northern hemisphere, continental drift was considered a discredited idea, a brilliant failure, a theory that could not work because nobody could explain how it worked. And so, for decades, the question of animal distribution and continental connections remained unresolved. Sunken continents and land bridges were increasingly hard to defend in the face of isostasy. Continental drift was rejected because it lacked a mechanism. The puzzles that had given birth to Lemuria remained puzzles, and no satisfactory solution was in sight. The breakthrough came in the 1950s and 60s, and it came not from the study of animals or fossils, but from the study of the ocean floor. Oceanographic surveys in the years following the Second World War revealed something remarkable about the floor of the world's oceans. Running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean like a spine was a vast underwater mountain range, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This ridge was the site of intense volcanic and seismic activity. It was producing new oceanic crust. Molten rock was welling up from the Earth's interior, solidifying and being pushed outward on either side of the ridge in a process called seafloor spreading. This discovery, made by scientists including Harry Hess and Robert Dietz in the early 1960s, provided the mechanism that Wegener had lacked. The continents were not plowing through the oceanic crust. They were being carried along on top of it, like passengers on a conveyor belt. The oceanic crust was being created at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed at subduction zones, places where one plate of crust dove beneath another and was recycled into the Earth's mantle. The Earth's surface was divided into a number of large, rigid plates, tectonic plates that were in constant motion, driven by convection currents in the underlying mantle. This was the theory of plate tectonics, and it revolutionized Earth science. It explained everything. It explained why the continents fit together like jigsaw pieces. It explained why the same fossils were found on continents now separated by oceans. It explained the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes. It explained the formation of mountain ranges. It explained the age and structure of the ocean floor. It was one of the great unifying theories of modern science, comparable to evolution in biology or the atomic theory in chemistry, and it demolished Lemuria. Plate tectonics showed conclusively that there had never been a continent in the Indian Ocean. The ocean floor of the Indian Ocean was composed of oceanic crust, thin, dense basaltic rock fundamentally different from the thick, light granitic rock of the continents. There was no trace of sunken continental crust. There were no remnants of a former landmass. The Indian Ocean had been an ocean for hundreds of millions of years. The distribution of lemurs, which had prompted Sclater's hypothesis in the first place, was now easily explained. India and Madagascar had once been part of Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent. They had been neighbors, joined together as part of a single landmass. Lemurs and their ancestors had walked freely between them. Then, around 88 million years ago, India began to separate from Madagascar. The Indian Ocean formed between them. India drifted northward, eventually colliding with Asia and pushing up the Himalayan mountains. Madagascar remained near Africa, isolated by the growing ocean. The lemurs on Madagascar, cut off from the rest of the world, evolved in isolation. They diversified into dozens of species, filling ecological niches that on other continents were filled by monkeys and apes. Their relatives on the Indian subcontinent, the lorises, survived in smaller numbers, overshadowed by the more advanced monkeys and apes that eventually reached Asia. There was no sunken continent, there was no land bridge. There was only the slow, majestic dance of the continents across the face of the Earth, driven by forces deep in the planet's interior, operating over timescales that dwarfed human comprehension. Sclater's hypothesis was dead. It had been killed not by skepticism or dismissal, but by better science. It had been killed by the discovery of the true mechanism of continental change, a mechanism more extraordinary and more awe-inspiring than any sunken continent. But here is the thing about myths. They do not die when the science that gave birth to them is disproved. They do not disappear when the evidence turns against them. Myths live on because they serve needs that science cannot address, needs for meaning, for wonder, for connection with the past, for hope about the future. The scientific hypothesis of Lemuria was dead by the 1960s, but the myth of Lemuria was more alive than ever. In the decades following the acceptance of plate tectonics, the idea of Lemuria continued to flourish in alternative and esoteric circles. Books about Lemuria proliferated. New channelers, psychics, and visionaries claimed to receive messages from the spirits of ancient Lemurians. New theories about Lemurian civilization, technology, and spirituality were proposed, and the legend continued to grow, fed by the same human needs that had always sustained it, the need to believe in a golden age, a lost paradise, a time when humanity was wiser, more powerful, and more connected to the divine. The New Age movement, which emerged in the 1960s and 70s, adopted Lemuria enthusiastically. In New Age thought, Lemuria became a spiritual paradise, a civilization of enlightened beings who had achieved a level of consciousness far beyond anything modern humans could imagine. The Lemurians were telepathic, they could levitate, they could communicate with animals and plants, they lived in perfect harmony with nature. They had no need for technology because their spiritual powers were so advanced that they could manifest anything they needed through thought alone. This vision of Lemuria was quite different from Blavatsky's. Blavatsky's Lemurians had been primitive in many ways, giant, egg-laying, barely intelligent creatures who had needed divine help to develop even basic consciousness. The New Age Lemurians, by contrast, were advanced, enlightened, and spiritually sophisticated. They were not primitive ancestors, but advanced precursors, a civilization that had already achieved what modern humanity was still struggling toward. This transformation reflected the broader values of the New Age movement, which emphasized spiritual growth, environmental harmony, and the recovery of lost wisdom. Lemuria became a mirror for New Age aspirations, a vision of what humanity could become if it turned away from materialism and technology and embraced a more spiritual, more natural way of life. One of the most interesting developments in the modern Lemuria myth was the association of Lemuria with specific physical locations. If Lemuria had existed, then perhaps fragments of it still survived, mountaintops and plateaus that had remained above sea level when the rest of the continent sank. These surviving fragments were identified with various real-world locations, most notably Mount Shasta in northern California. Mount Shasta, a majestic volcanic peak rising over 14,000 feet, became, in the 20th century, a major center of Lemurian belief. The idea that Mount Shasta was connected to Lemuria dates back to at least the 1930s. when various occult writers claimed that the mountain was home to a hidden community of Lemurian survivors, advanced beings who had escaped the destruction of their continent and had established a secret city inside the mountain. These stories were popularized by writers like Frederick Spencer Oliver, whose novel A Dweller on Two Planets, published in 1894, described an advanced civilization inside Mount Shasta, and by Guy Ballard, the founder of the IAM movement, who claimed to have met an ascended master named Saint Germain on the slopes of the mountain in the 1930s. Over the decades, Mount Shasta accumulated a thick layer of Lemurian lore. Visitors claimed to see strange lights on the mountain. They reported encountering tall, robed figures in the forests. They described mystical experiences and spiritual awakenings. The mountain became a pilgrimage site for those who believed in the Lemurian legacy, and the nearby town developed a thriving cottage industry catering to spiritual seekers and Lemuria enthusiasts. The Mount Shasta-Lemuria connection is a fascinating example of how a myth can attach itself to a physical landscape and transform its meaning. Mount Shasta is a real mountain with a real geological history. It is a volcano, part of the Cascade Range, formed by the subduction of the Juan de Fuca Plate beneath the North American Plate. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Lemuria, the Indian Ocean, or sunken continents. But the myth has given it a new significance, a spiritual significance, that is, for many people, more real and more meaningful than its geological history. Let us now consider the deeper question that the story of Lemuria raises. Why are we so drawn to the idea of lost continents? Why do stories of sunken civilizations and vanished lands exercise such a powerful hold on the human imagination? What is it about the idea of a lost world beneath the waves that resonates so deeply with so many people? Part of the answer, surely, is the romance of the unknown. The ocean is the last great frontier on our planet. We have mapped the surfaces of distant moons more thoroughly than we have mapped the floor of our own oceans. The deep sea remains a place of mystery, darkness, and wonder. It is easy to imagine, it is almost irresistible to imagine that down there, beneath the waves, there are secrets waiting to be discovered. Cities, civilizations, knowledge, treasures, but there is something deeper at work. The myth of the lost continent is, at its heart, a myth about paradise lost. It is a story about a golden age, a time when humanity was wiser, happier, more powerful, and more in harmony with the natural and spiritual worlds. It is a story about a fall, a catastrophe that destroyed this paradise and left humanity diminished, scattered, and struggling. And it is a story about hope, the hope that the lost wisdom can be recovered, that the golden age can return, that humanity can regain what it has lost. This is one of the oldest and most universal themes in human mythology. It appears in the Garden of Eden story in the Hebrew Bible. It appears in the Greek myth of the Golden Age. It appears in the Hindu concept of the yugas, the great cycles of time through which the world passes, from the perfect Satya Yuga to the degraded Kali Yuga. It appears in the mythologies of indigenous peoples around the world. The details differ, but the underlying pattern is the same. There was once a better time, it was lost, and perhaps it can be found again. Lemuria plugs into this universal pattern. It is Eden. It is the Golden Age. It is the Satya Yuga. It is the paradise before the fall, and the fact that it was once, however briefly, endorsed by science gives it a credibility that purely mythological paradises lack. People can point to Sclater's paper, they can invoke Haeckel's maps, they can say, even science believed in Lemuria. And this scientific pedigree, however outdated and however misrepresented, lends the myth an air of respectability that sustains it long after the science has moved on. There is another dimension to the Lemuria story that deserves attention, and that is the role of what we might call alternative archaeology, the broad movement of writers, researchers, and enthusiasts who argue that conventional history and archaeology have got it wrong, that there were advanced civilizations in the deep past that have been overlooked, ignored, or suppressed by mainstream scholarship. This movement has a long history. It includes writers like Ignatius Donnelly, whose 1882 book, Atlantis, the antediluvian world argued that Atlantis was a real place and the source of all human civilization. It includes James Churchward, a British writer who, in the 1920s and 30s, proposed the existence of yet another lost continent, Mu, in the Pacific Ocean. It includes more recent writers like Graham Hancock, whose books argue for the existence of an advanced global civilization that was destroyed by a catastrophe at the end of the last ice age. Lemuria fits naturally into this alternative archaeological tradition. It is one of a family of lost continent myths, Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, that share common features: an advanced ancient civilization, a catastrophic destruction, a few survivors who carry fragments of the lost wisdom to other lands. These myths reinforce each other. Believers in Atlantis tend also to believe in Lemuria. Believers in Mu tend to believe in both. The various lost continents form a constellation of related ideas, a shared mythological framework that provides an alternative to mainstream history. This alternative framework is appealing for several reasons. First, it is dramatic. It replaces the slow, gradual, often tedious process of real historical change with sudden catastrophes, lost civilizations, and hidden knowledge. It is a better story. Second, it is flattering. It implies that human beings were once far more advanced than mainstream science believes, that our ancestors were not primitive hunter-gatherers slowly developing agriculture and writing, but were instead the heirs of a glorious civilization that had mastered powers beyond our current understanding. Third, it is conspiratorial. It implies that mainstream science and academia are either ignorant of or actively suppressing the truth about humanity's past. This appeals to people who distrust established institutions and enjoy the feeling of knowing something that the experts do not. All of these factors contribute to the enduring popularity of Lemuria and its sister myths. They are not going away anytime soon. Despite the overwhelming evidence against them, despite the complete absence of archaeological or geological support, these myths continue to thrive because they satisfy deep human needs that science alone cannot address. We should also consider the harm that these myths can do. While the idea of a lost continent might seem harmless, a bit of fun, a pleasant fantasy, it can have real-world consequences that are not always benign. The racial theories embedded in Blavatsky's version of the Lemurian myth are a case in point. By assigning different levels of spiritual development to different racial groups, Blavatsky created a hierarchy that placed white Europeans at the top and indigenous peoples at the bottom. This hierarchy was not merely academic. It had real implications for how people thought about race, civilization, and human worth, and it was picked up and amplified by later writers and movements, some of which took it in genuinely dangerous directions. The most notorious example is the appropriation of theosophical racial theories by certain elements of the early 20th century German occult movement. The concept of root races and Aryan supremacy, ideas that originated in Blavatsky's writings, though she almost certainly did not intend them to be used in this way, were adopted and distorted by individuals and groups who used them to justify racial persecution and worse. The line from Blavatsky's root races to the darkest chapters of 20th century history is not straight, but it exists, and it serves as a warning about the unintended consequences of mythological thinking. Even in less extreme forms, the Lemurian myth can be harmful. When it is used to make unfounded claims about the origins of particular cultures or languages, as in the more extreme versions of the Kumari Kandam narrative, it can distort historical understanding and promote chauvinism. When it is used to sell books, seminars, and spiritual retreats based on fabricated history, it can exploit people's genuine desire for knowledge and spiritual growth. And when it is presented as an alternative to real science, it can undermine public understanding of geology, biology, and the history of the Earth. This is not to say that everyone who is interested in Lemuria is harmful or malicious. Most people who are drawn to the myth are simply curious, imaginative, and open to wonder, qualities that are entirely admirable. But it is important to distinguish between wonder and credulity, between imaginative engagement with the past and uncritical acceptance of unfounded claims. The story of Lemuria is a wonderful story. It is a fascinating story. It is a story worth knowing and thinking about, but it is not history. It is myth, and myths, for all their power and beauty, are not the same as truth. As we reach the end of this first part of our journey through the story of Lemuria, let us take stock of where we have been. We began with a scientific puzzle, the distribution of lemurs across the Indian Ocean. We saw how Philip Sclater, a respected Victorian zoologist, proposed the existence of a sunken continent to explain this distribution. We saw how Ernst Haeckel expanded the idea, making Lemuria the cradle of humanity. We saw how the geological framework of the 19th century, the contraction theory, made sunken continents seem plausible, even necessary. We then watched as the idea was transformed. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, took Sclater's sober scientific hypothesis and turned it into the setting for a cosmic drama, a story of root races, spiritual evolution, psychic powers, and catastrophic destruction. Her successors, Scott-Elliot, Steiner, and many others, added detail and complexity to the myth, creating a rich and elaborate alternative history of humanity. We saw how the idea was adopted by Tamil cultural nationalists, who identified Lemuria with the legendary lost land of Kumari Kandam and used it as a source of cultural pride and identity. We saw how it was embraced by the New Age movement, which reimagined Lemuria as a spiritual paradise of enlightened beings. And we saw how the science moved on. We saw how the discovery of Isostasy undermined the idea that continents could sink. We saw how Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift as an alternative explanation for the distribution of animals and fossils. And we saw how the theory of plate tectonics, developed in the 1950s and 60s, conclusively disproved the existence of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean and provided a far better explanation for everything that Lemuria had been invoked to explain. The scientific hypothesis of Lemuria is dead. It has been dead for decades. But the myth of Lemuria lives on in books, in films, in spiritual movements, in cultural traditions, and in the imaginations of millions of people around the world. It lives on because it tells a story that people want to hear, a story of lost glory, hidden wisdom, and the possibility of recovery. It lives on because it satisfies needs that science, for all its power and beauty, cannot fully address. In the second part of our exploration, we will delve deeper into the legacy of Lemuria. We will examine how the myth has evolved in the 20th and 21st centuries. We will look at the specific claims made about Lemurian civilization and evaluate them against the evidence. We will explore the geology of the Indian Ocean in greater detail, seeing what the ocean floor actually reveals about the history of the Earth. We will consider the broader phenomenon of lost continent myths and what they tell us about the human mind. And we will ask the ultimate question: what, if anything, can we learn from the story of Lemuria? The waters of the Indian Ocean are deep and they hold many secrets, but a sunken continent is not one of them. The real story, the story of drifting continents, evolving species, and the restless creativity of the human imagination, is far more extraordinary than any myth. The continent of Lemuria never existed, but the idea of Lemuria, the dream of a lost world beneath the waves, that idea is as real and as powerful as any geological fact. It has shaped science, it has shaped spirituality, it has shaped culture, and it continues to shape the way millions of people think about the past, the present, and the future of the human species. That is the paradox of Lemuria. It is a fiction that has made history. It is a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. It is a continent that exists nowhere on Earth and everywhere in the human heart. The waters close over the place where Lemuria was supposed to have been. The Indian Ocean rolls on, vast and indifferent, keeping its real secrets. The tectonic plates grind slowly against one another, reshaping the world at a pace too slow for any human lifetime to perceive. And somewhere someone is reading about Lemuria, dreaming about Lemuria, believing in Lemuria. The continent that never was continues to rise, not from the ocean floor, but from the depths of the human imagination. And in that sense, in that purely human sense, Lemuria will never truly sink. When we left the story of Lemuria, we stood at a crossroads. The science that had given birth to the idea was dead, killed by the revolution of plate tectonics. But the myth, the dream of a sunken paradise in the Indian Ocean, was more alive than ever. It had spread from Victorian zoology to theosophical mysticism, from theosophical mysticism to Tamil cultural nationalism, from Tamil cultural nationalism to New Age spirituality, and from New Age spirituality into the broad currents of popular culture, where it continues to flow, strong and deep, to this day. Now we must follow that current. We must trace the rivers of belief and imagination that carry the Lemurian idea forward into the modern world. We must look beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean to see what is actually there. And we must ask the hardest question of all, not whether Lemuria existed, because it did not, but why so many people continue to believe that it did, and what that belief tells us about who we are as a species. Let us begin by going beneath the surface. Not the surface of myth or belief, but the literal surface of the Indian Ocean. Let us descend into the darkness and the cold and the crushing pressure, down to the ocean floor itself, and see what the earth actually tells us about the history of this vast body of water. The Indian Ocean is the third largest ocean on the planet, after the Pacific and the Atlantic. It covers approximately 70 million square kilometers. Its average depth is around 3,700 meters, and its deepest point, the Sunda Trench, also known as the Java Trench, south of Indonesia, plunges to more than 7,400 meters below sea level. It is bounded by Africa to the west, Asia to the north, Australia to the east, and the Southern Ocean to the south. It is crossed by underwater mountain ranges, scarred by fracture zones, and dotted with volcanic islands. It is a dynamic, complex, and geologically fascinating body of water, and its floor tells a story written in rock and sediment, in magnetic signatures and isotopic ratios, in the thickness of the crust and the age of the basalt. It is a story that geologists have been reading for the past 60 years, using increasingly sophisticated tools and techniques, and it is a story that leaves absolutely no room for a sunken continent. The floor of the Indian Ocean is composed of oceanic crust. This is a fundamental point, and it is worth dwelling on because it is the single most important piece of evidence against the existence of Lemuria. There are two kinds of crust on the surface of the Earth: continental crust and oceanic crust. They are fundamentally different in composition, thickness, density, and age. Continental crust is made primarily of granitic rocks, light-colored, relatively low-density rocks rich in silica and aluminum. It is thick, typically 30 to 50 kilometers deep, and in some places, beneath mountain ranges like the Himalayas, it can be 70 kilometers thick or more. It is old. Some continental crust is nearly 4 billion years old. It is buoyant. Because it is lighter than the mantle beneath it, it rides high, standing above sea level to form the continents we know. Oceanic crust is made primarily of basaltic rocks, dark, dense rocks rich in iron and magnesium. It is thin, typically only 5 to 10 kilometers thick. It is young, geologically speaking. No oceanic crust on Earth is older than about 200 million years because it is constantly being created at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed at subduction zones. It is dense. Because it is heavier than continental crust, it rides lower on the mantle, forming the floors of the oceans. These two types of crust are as different as wood and iron. They are made of different materials. They behave differently under geological forces. They have different histories and different fates, and they are easy to distinguish using modern geophysical techniques, seismic surveys, gravity measurements, magnetic surveys, and deep-sea drilling. When geologists surveyed the floor of the Indian Ocean, they found oceanic crust everywhere, without exception. The entire floor of the Indian Ocean, from the coast of Africa to the coast of Australia, from the shores of India to the edge of Antarctica, is composed of oceanic basalt. There is no continental crust on the floor of the Indian Ocean. There are no remnants of a sunken continent. There are no fragments of granitic rock that might indicate a former landmass. There is nothing but basalt and the sediment that has slowly accumulated on top of it over millions of years. This is conclusive. This is definitive. This is the geological equivalent of opening a chest that is supposed to contain treasure and finding it empty. If a continent had once existed in the Indian Ocean and had sunk, there would be evidence of it in the crust. Continental crust does not simply vanish. It does not transform into oceanic crust. It does not dissolve into the mantle. It is there or it is not there, and in the Indian Ocean it is not there. There is one partial exception to this statement, and it is worth mentioning because it has sometimes been cited by Lemuria enthusiasts as evidence for a sunken continent. In 2013, a team of geologists studying rocks from the island of Mauritius, a small volcanic island in the western Indian Ocean, discovered grains of the mineral zircon that were far older than the volcanic rocks in which they were embedded. Some of these zircon grains were nearly 2 billion years old, far older than anything that should exist on a volcanic island formed from oceanic crust. The explanation the geologists proposed was that beneath Mauritius, and possibly beneath other islands in the area including parts of Madagascar, there are fragments of ancient continental crust. Not a continent, but small fragments, pieces of continental material that were left behind when the supercontinent of Gondwana broke up. As India separated from Madagascar roughly 88 million years ago, stretching and thinning the crust between them, some fragments of continental material were stranded beneath the growing ocean. Later volcanic activity, which built up the Mascarenes Plateau and the islands of Mauritius and Réunion, brought some of this ancient continental material back to the surface. This discovery made headlines. Some news outlets predictably ran stories with titles suggesting that a lost continent had been found in the Indian Ocean. Lemuria enthusiasts seized on the discovery as vindication. At last, they said, science was confirming what had been known all along: there was a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean. But this interpretation is profoundly misleading. The fragments of continental crust beneath Mauritius are not a continent. They are not even close. They are small, thin slivers of ancient material, remnants of Gondwana's breakup, stretched and thinned almost beyond recognition. They bear no resemblance to the vast, continent-sized landmass that Sclater proposed or the even vaster paradise that Blavatsky described. Finding these fragments is like finding a few crumbs on a plate and concluding that a feast was served. The crumbs are real, they are interesting, they tell us something about the geological history of the region. But they do not support the idea of a sunken continent, not in the slightest. The geological history of the Indian Ocean is, in fact, well understood. It is one of the great success stories of plate tectonics, a story told in rock, magnetism, and the patient accumulation of evidence over decades of research. The story begins with Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent that existed from roughly 500 million years ago until it began to break apart about 180 million years ago. Gondwana comprised what are now South America, Africa, India, Madagascar, Antarctica, and Australia. These landmasses were joined together, forming a single vast continent in the southern hemisphere. Around 180 million years ago, Gondwana began to break apart. The breakup was driven by the same forces that drive all plate tectonics and convection currents in the Earth's mantle, the slow churning of the planet's interior, the heat rising from the core and driving the plates apart. Rifts appeared in the crust, magma welled up through the rifts, new oceanic crust was formed, and slowly, inexorably, the fragments of Gondwana began to drift apart. Africa and South America separated first, opening the South Atlantic Ocean. India and Madagascar separated from Antarctica and Australia, drifting northward. Then India separated from Madagascar around 88 million years ago and began its long journey north toward Asia, a journey that would end some 40 to 50 million years ago with the collision of India and the Asian plate, a collision that pushed up the Himalayan mountains and continues to this day. As India drifted north, the Indian Ocean opened behind it. New oceanic crust was formed at the mid-ocean ridges that marked the boundaries between the separating plates. Sediment accumulated on the new ocean floor. Volcanic islands rose and fell, and the ocean grew wider and deeper over millions of years. This process is recorded in exquisite detail in the rocks of the ocean floor. The age of the oceanic crust increases systematically as you move away from the mid-ocean ridges. The youngest crust is at the ridges themselves, where new material is being created right now. The oldest crust is at the edges of the ocean, near the continents, where the earliest ocean floor was formed when Gondwana first began to break apart. The magnetic signatures in the rocks record the periodic reversals of the Earth's magnetic field, creating a pattern of magnetic stripes that serves as a geological clock, allowing scientists to date the ocean floor with remarkable precision. Every piece of evidence, every seismic survey, every magnetic measurement, every core sample, every gravity anomaly tells the same story. The Indian Ocean has been forming for roughly 180 million years. It has been growing wider as the surrounding continents have drifted apart. Its floor is composed of oceanic crust, not continental crust, and there has never been a continent in the middle of it. Lemuria is not hiding beneath the waves. It was never there to hide. But let us not merely refute the myth. Let us also celebrate what the real science reveals, because the true story of the Indian Ocean is far more extraordinary than any tale of sunken continents. Consider, for a moment, the journey of India. Here is a fragment of continent, a great slab of ancient rock that detached from the southern supercontinent and began drifting northward through the ocean. It moved at a rate that, by geological standards, was startlingly fast, perhaps 15 to 20 centimeters per year. It crossed thousands of kilometers of ocean over millions of years, and then, roughly 50 million years ago, it slammed into the southern edge of the Asian continent. The collision was and is stupendous. The force of India's northward push crumpled the crust at the collision zone, folding and stacking layers of rock thousands of meters thick. The Himalayan mountains, the highest mountains on Earth, were pushed up by this collision, and they are still rising, still growing, still being driven upward by the relentless pressure of India against Asia. The Tibetan Plateau, the roof of the world, was lifted to an average elevation of over 4,500 meters above sea level. The entire climate of Asia was reshaped by the rise of the Himalayas, which created the monsoon system that brings life-giving rains to billions of people. This is a real story. This happened. It is supported by overwhelming evidence, and it is far more dramatic, far more awe-inspiring, and far more consequential than any tale of a psychic civilization on a continent that never existed. The real history of the Indian Ocean, the breakup of Gondwana, the drift of India, the collision with Asia, the rise of the Himalayas, the creation of the monsoon, is one of the great epic narratives of Earth science. It unfolds over hundreds of millions of years. It involves forces of unimaginable power. It shaped the world we live in, and it is true. Now let us turn our attention back to the cultural and intellectual legacy of Lemuria, because the story of how this idea has been used, adapted, and transformed in the 20th and 21st centuries is itself a fascinating chapter in the history of human thought. We have already discussed Blavatsky and her successors, the Tamil cultural nationalists, and the early New Age movement. But the Lemurian myth continued to evolve after these early adoptions, taking on new forms and finding new audiences in each successive decade. In the 1920s and 30s, a British writer named James Churchward published a series of books that introduced yet another lost continent into the mix, a continent he called Mu. According to Churchward, Mu had been a vast civilization in the Pacific Ocean, the original homeland of humanity, the source of all culture and religion. It had been destroyed by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and had sunk beneath the Pacific roughly 12,000 years ago. Churchward's Mu was essentially Lemuria relocated. The basic concept was the same: a sunken continent, an advanced civilization, a catastrophic destruction. But Churchward placed his continent in the Pacific rather than the Indian Ocean, and he claimed to have obtained his information from ancient tablets shown to him by a Hindu priest in India. These tablets, he said, were written in a language called Haeckel, the original language of humanity, and they contain the history of Mu in exquisite detail. Needless to say, no one else has ever seen these tablets. No evidence of the Nacal language has ever been found outside of Churchward's writings. And the geological evidence against a continent in the Pacific Ocean is just as strong as the evidence against one in the Indian Ocean. But Churchward's books were popular. They sold well. They introduced the idea of a Pacific lost continent to a wide audience. And they further blurred the already fuzzy boundary between Lemuria and Mu, so that many people today use the two names interchangeably, or combine them into a single composite myth of a great continent that once stretched across both the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The relationship between Lemuria and Mu is worth examining, because it illustrates how lost continent myths tend to merge and overlap. Both myths share the same basic structure: an ancient continent, an advanced civilization, a catastrophic destruction, a few survivors. Both myths draw on the same pool of evidence, or rather, the same pool of pseudo-evidence. Both myths appeal to the same psychological needs, and both myths have been adopted by similar communities of believers. Over time, the distinctions between them have become increasingly blurred, so that Lemuria and Mu are now often treated as synonyms for the same imaginary place. This merging of myths is a common phenomenon in the world of alternative history. Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu are frequently discussed together, as if they were different provinces of a single lost world. Writers combine elements from all three traditions, creating hybrid narratives that draw on Plato, Blavatsky, Churchward, and a host of other sources. The result is a rich, complex, and internally inconsistent mythology that is virtually impossible to refute because it is constantly shifting, constantly absorbing new elements, and constantly adapting to new contexts. The mid-20th century saw Lemuria adopted by a new and unexpected community, the science fiction and fantasy writing community. Writers of speculative fiction had always been drawn to lost civilizations and sunken continents. The idea of a vast, advanced civilization destroyed by a cataclysm and surviving only in fragmentary ruins and fading legends was irresistibly dramatic. It provided a ready-made setting for adventure stories, mystery stories, and tales of wonder. The great American horror and fantasy writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft made extensive use of lost continent mythology in his fiction, though he drew more heavily on Atlantis and his own invented settings than on Lemuria specifically. But other writers in the pulp fiction tradition embraced Lemuria wholeheartedly. Richard Shaver, an American writer who published a series of sensational stories in the magazine Amazing Stories in the 1940s, claimed that an advanced civilization had once existed underground, a civilization connected to Lemuria and Atlantis, and that its degenerate descendants, called Daros, still lived beneath the earth, using ancient technology to torment surface dwellers. Shaver's stories caused a sensation. The editor of Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer, presented them not as fiction but as fact, or at least as based on real experiences that Shaver had had. Readers wrote in by the thousands, some claiming to have had similar experiences. The Shaver mystery, as it became known, was one of the earliest examples of what we would now call a viral conspiracy theory, spread through the medium of pulp magazines rather than the internet. The Shaver mystery eventually faded, but it left a lasting mark on popular culture. It helped to establish the trope of the hollow earth, the idea that advanced civilizations exist beneath the surface of the planet, that would later appear in countless books, films, and television shows. And it demonstrated once again the extraordinary staying power of lost continent myths and their ability to adapt to new media and new audiences. In the world of fantasy literature, Lemuria became a standard setting. Writers like Lynn Carter, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard all set stories in Lemuria or Lemurian-inspired settings. These fictional Lemurias were typically portrayed as exotic, dangerous, and filled with ancient magic, very different from the scientific hypothesis that had originally borne the name, but recognizably descended from the same imaginative tradition. The influence of Lemuria on popular culture extended beyond literature. Films, television shows, comic books, and video games have all drawn on the Lemurian myth. The idea of a sunken civilization beneath the ocean, whether called Lemuria, Atlantis, or something else entirely, has become one of the stock settings of popular entertainment. It is so deeply embedded in our cultural vocabulary that most people encounter it without even realizing its origins, without knowing that it began as a perfectly respectable scientific hypothesis about lemur distribution in the 1860s. Let us now examine a question that takes us to the very edge where science, mythology, and psychology intersect. This is the question of why people really believe, deeply and sincerely in things like Lemuria, despite the overwhelming evidence against them. This is not a trivial question. It is not enough to dismiss believers in Lemuria as foolish or gullible. Many of them are intelligent, thoughtful, and well-intentioned people. They are drawn to the idea of Lemuria not because they are stupid, but because the idea offers them something that mainstream science and mainstream culture do not. Understanding what that something is, understanding the psychological, emotional, and social needs that Lemuria fulfills, is essential if we want to understand not just this particular myth, but the broader phenomenon of belief in alternative histories and hidden truths. The first and most obvious need that Lemuria fulfills is the need for wonder. Modern science, for all its magnificence, can sometimes feel cold and impersonal. It reduces the world to equations and mechanisms. It explains the rainbow by analyzing the refraction of light. It explains the stars by calculating the fusion of hydrogen atoms. It explains the diversity of life by tracing the slow, impersonal process of natural selection. These explanations are beautiful in their own way, but they can feel, to some people, like explanations that drain the world of magic. Lemuria restores the magic. It populates the past with wonders, with giant psychic beings, with lost civilizations, with powers and abilities that transcend the ordinary. It makes the world feel bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than the world described by textbooks and scientific papers. For people who hunger for enchantment, Lemuria offers a feast. The second need is the need for meaning. Mainstream science tells us that humans evolved through a process of natural selection that had no purpose, no direction, and no plan. We are the products of billions of years of random variation and environmental pressure. There is no cosmic meaning in our existence. There is no hidden plan guiding our development. We are here because our ancestors survived and reproduced, and that is all. For many people, this is deeply unsatisfying. They want their existence to mean something. They want to be part of a larger story, a cosmic drama with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Lemuria, as presented by Blavatsky and her successors, offers exactly this. It places humanity in a grand narrative of spiritual evolution, a story in which each root race represents a step in the development of consciousness, a story in which the present moment is not random but purposeful, part of a vast cosmic plan that stretches back millions of years and forward into an unimaginable future. This narrative gives life meaning, it gives suffering a purpose, it gives hope a foundation, and for people who need these things and who among us does not. The appeal is very powerful. The third need is the need for community. Believing in Lemuria or in Atlantis or in any alternative historical narrative creates a sense of belonging. It connects you to a community of like-minded people who share your worldview, your values, and your sense that the mainstream has got it wrong. This community provides social support, intellectual stimulation, and emotional validation. It tells you that you are not alone in your beliefs, that others share your vision, and that together you are part of a movement that is gradually uncovering the truth. This need for community is one of the most powerful drivers of belief in alternative narratives. People do not adopt beliefs in isolation. They adopt them in social contexts, through conversations with friends, through participation in groups, through reading books recommended by people they trust. Once a belief has been adopted and shared with others, it becomes very difficult to abandon, because abandoning the belief would mean abandoning the community that sustains it. The fourth need is the need for autonomy, the need to feel that you are thinking for yourself, that you are not simply accepting what authorities tell you, that you have examined the evidence independently and reached your own conclusions. In a world where expertise is increasingly specialized and increasingly inaccessible, many people feel alienated from the institutions, universities, scientific organizations, government agencies that claim to possess authoritative knowledge. They feel that these institutions are elitist, self-serving, or corrupt. They feel that the truth is being hidden or suppressed, and they are drawn to alternative narratives that promise to reveal what the establishment does not want you to know. Lemuria fits this pattern perfectly. It is an idea that the scientific establishment has rejected. Believing in it is, in a sense, an act of intellectual rebellion, a refusal to accept the authority of mainstream science, a declaration of independence from the tyranny of expert opinion. For people who value autonomy and distrust authority, this is deeply attractive. These four needs, wonder, meaning, community, and autonomy, go a long way toward explaining why people believe in Lemuria. They are not the only factors, of course. Individual psychology, personal experiences, cultural background, and many other variables play a role. But these four needs are, I believe, the most important, and understanding them is essential for anyone who wants to engage constructively with believers in alternative narratives. It is also important to recognize that the boundary between mainstream science and alternative belief is not always as clear-cut as it might seem. Science is a human activity, conducted by human beings with all their biases, prejudices, and limitations. The history of science is full of ideas that were rejected by the establishment and later proved correct. Continental drift is a perfect example, rejected for 50 years, then vindicated by plate tectonics. The germ theory of disease was ridiculed before it was accepted. The idea that the Earth orbits the Sun was heresy before it was common knowledge. Believers in Lemuria are well aware of these precedents. They cite them frequently. They argue that just as continental drift was rejected before being accepted, so too will the existence of Lemuria eventually be confirmed. They argue that science is always evolving, always revising its conclusions, and that today's rejected hypothesis may be tomorrow's established fact. This argument has a superficial plausibility, but it is ultimately misleading. It is true that some rejected ideas have later proved correct, but far more rejected ideas have remained rejected because they were wrong. For every continental drift, there are 100 perpetual motion machines. For every germ theory, there are 1,000 flat Earths. The fact that some rejected ideas have been vindicated does not mean that all rejected ideas will be vindicated. Each idea must be evaluated on its own merits, based on the evidence for and against it. And the evidence against Lemuria is overwhelming, conclusive, and growing stronger with every new oceanographic survey. The appeal to past scientific errors is a logical fallacy, the fallacy of assuming that because science has been wrong before, it might be wrong now. This fallacy ignores the crucial question of evidence. Science was wrong about continental drift because the evidence for it was incomplete and the mechanism was unknown. But when better evidence became available and a viable mechanism was discovered, science corrected itself. Science is self-correcting. That is its greatest strength. And the self-correction that produced plate tectonics is the same self-correction that disproved Lemuria. Let us now examine some of the specific claims that have been made about Lemurian civilization and evaluate them against the available evidence. Claim: Lemuria was a continent in the Indian Ocean that sank beneath the waves. As we have already seen, this claim is disproved by the geological evidence. The floor of the Indian Ocean is composed of oceanic crust. There is no continental crust on the ocean floor. A continent cannot sink because continental crust is lighter than the mantle and floats on top of it. The idea of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean is physically impossible. Claim: the Lemurians possessed psychic powers, including telepathy, clairvoyance, and telekinesis. There is no credible scientific evidence for the existence of any psychic powers. Telepathy, clairvoyance, and telekinesis have been extensively tested under controlled conditions, and no reliable evidence for their existence has ever been found. The claim that an entire civilization possessed these powers is therefore unsupported, and given the complete absence of evidence for the civilization itself, untestable. Claim: the Lemurians had a third eye, a physical organ of psychic perception. No species of primate, living or fossil, has ever possessed a third eye. Some reptiles, amphibians, and fish do have a parietal eye, a light-sensitive organ on top of the head that helps regulate circadian rhythms, but this is not a fully functional eye and it has no connection to psychic powers. The pineal gland in the human brain, which Blavatsky identified as the vestigial remnant of the Lemurian third eye, is a real organ that produces melatonin and helps regulate sleep cycles. It has no psychic functions. Claim: Lemuria was the cradle of humanity, the place where humans first evolved. As we discussed in the first part, this claim was originally made by Ernst Haeckel in the 1870s. It has been conclusively disproved by more than a century of paleontological research. The fossil evidence overwhelmingly shows that humans evolved in Africa. The earliest hominin fossils, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and early Homo species, are all found in Africa. The idea that humans evolved on a continent that never existed is doubly wrong about the location and wrong about the continent. Claim: the indigenous peoples of certain regions are descendants of the Lemurians. This claim, which was central to Blavatsky's racial theory, is not supported by any genetic, archaeological, or linguistic evidence. Modern genetic studies have traced the migrations of human populations with remarkable precision, using mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and whole genome sequencing. These studies show that all modern human populations are descended from ancestors who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. There is no trace in the human genome of descent from a separate race of beings on a different continent. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. All humans share a common African ancestry. Claim: ancient Tamil civilization originated on Lemuria. This claim, central to the Kumari Kandam narrative, is not supported by archaeological evidence. The earliest evidence of Tamil civilization, archaeological sites, inscriptions, literary works, dates to the first millennium BCE. There is no evidence of a Tamil civilization older than this, let alone one that existed on a sunken continent millions of years ago. The Sangam literary tradition refers to lost lands and sunken cities, but these references may reflect folk memories of actual coastal inundation events, the gradual submersion of coastal areas due to rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, rather than the sinking of an entire continent. It is worth noting that real coastal inundation has occurred in the Indian Ocean region. Sea levels rose significantly at the end of the last ice age, between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, and many coastal areas that were inhabited by humans were submerged. Archaeological sites have been found underwater off the coasts of India and other countries in the region. These are real sites with real artifacts, and they provide genuine evidence of human habitation on land that is now beneath the sea. But they are evidence of coastal inundation, not of a sunken continent. The scale is entirely different. A few hundred square kilometers of coastal land submerged by rising sea levels is not the same as a continent the size of Africa sinking into the mantle. Claim: there are ruins of Lemurian cities on the ocean floor. No ruins of any kind that could be attributed to an advanced prehistoric civilization have been found on the floor of the Indian Ocean. The underwater archaeological sites that have been found in the region, such as the controversial structures off the coast of Gujarat in the Gulf of Cambay, are either natural geological formations or the remains of relatively recent coastal settlements that were submerged by rising sea levels. None of them bear any resemblance to what a Lemurian city would look like according to the myth. None of them are located in the deep ocean, where a sunken continent would be expected to be found. And none of them are accompanied by the kind of artifacts, tools, pottery, inscriptions, art that would indicate an advanced civilization. Claim: Mount Shasta contains a hidden city of Lemurian survivors. Mount Shasta is a stratovolcano in the Cascade Range. It has been extensively studied by geologists, and no hidden chambers, underground cities, or evidence of habitation have been found inside or beneath the mountain. The strange lights that have been reported on the mountain are most likely the result of ordinary phenomena, campfires, headlights, atmospheric effects, or, in some cases, deliberate hoaxes. The tall, robed figures that visitors have claimed to see in the forests around the mountain are presumably either misidentified hikers, the product of overactive imaginations, or, again, deliberate fabrications. Having examined and dismissed the specific claims of the Lemurian myth, let us now consider the broader phenomenon of which Lemuria is a part, the phenomenon of lost continent myths in general. Lost continent myths are found in cultures around the world. In addition to Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu, there are numerous other traditions of sunken lands and vanished civilizations. The Celtic tradition speaks of High Brazil, a phantom island in the Atlantic that appeared on maps for centuries before being finally removed. The Welsh tradition speaks of Cantre'r Gwaelod, a drowned kingdom in Cardigan Bay. The Breton tradition speaks of the city of Wise, swallowed by the sea as punishment for the sins of its inhabitants. Indian tradition speaks of Dwarka, the city of the god Krishna, which is said to have sunk beneath the sea after Krishna's death. And many Pacific island cultures have traditions of sunken lands and submerged civilizations. Some of these traditions may have a basis in real events. Coastal inundation, as we have discussed, is a real geological phenomenon. Sea levels have risen and fallen dramatically over the course of Earth's history, and lands that were inhabited by humans have been submerged. The flooding of the Black Sea Basin, the submersion of Doggerland in the North Sea, the inundation of coastal areas in the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea, all of these are real events that may have given rise to legends of drowned lands. The folk memory of such events, passed down through generations and gradually transformed by the processes of myth-making, could well be the seed from which many sunken land legends grew. But there is a crucial difference between a folk memory of coastal inundation and a full-blown lost continent myth. The folk memory says, there was land here once and now it is underwater. The lost continent myth says, there was a magnificent civilization here, more advanced than anything that exists today, and it was destroyed in a terrible cataclysm. The first statement may well be true. The second is, in every known case, a product of imagination, elaboration, and wishful thinking. The transformation from folk memory to myth is a process that can be traced in many cases. A real event, the submersion of a coastal area, the destruction of a city by a tsunami, the flooding of a river valley, is remembered. As it is passed down from generation to generation, it is embellished. The lost land becomes larger. The lost city becomes more magnificent. The catastrophe becomes more dramatic, and eventually the original event, a local, limited, and entirely natural occurrence, has been transformed into a cosmic drama involving an entire continent, an advanced civilization, and a divine punishment. This process of mythological elaboration is not conscious or deliberate. It is a natural consequence of the way human memory and storytelling work. We do not remember events exactly as they happened. We reshape them, embellish them, and fit them into narrative frameworks that give them meaning and coherence. Over time, a real event can become unrecognizable, buried beneath layers of elaboration, interpretation, and invention. Lemuria is an interesting case because it did not originate as a folk memory. It originated as a scientific hypothesis, but it underwent the same process of mythological elaboration that transforms folk memories into legends. The original hypothesis, a sunken land bridge in the Indian Ocean, was embellished by Haeckel, the cradle of humanity, transformed by Blavatsky, a civilization of psychic giants, elaborated by Scott-Elliot and Steiner, with detailed descriptions of Lemurian life and culture, and further embellished by each subsequent generation of writers and believers. The result is a myth as rich, as detailed, and as compelling as any ancient legend, but one that began not in the mists of prehistoric time, but in a scientific paper published in 1864. There is a philosophical dimension to the Lemuria story that is worth exploring. It concerns the nature of truth and the different ways in which human beings seek and find it. For the scientist, truth is found through observation, hypothesis, experiment, and evidence. A claim is true if it is supported by evidence and can withstand attempts at falsification. Lemuria is not true by this standard. The evidence does not support it. The geology disproves it. The hypothesis has been falsified. For the mystic, truth is found through inner experience, spiritual revelation, and intuitive knowing. A claim is true if it resonates with spiritual reality, if it is confirmed by inner vision, if it aligns with the teachings of spiritual masters. Lemuria may be true by this standard for those who accept spiritual experience as a valid source of knowledge. Blavatsky claimed to have received her information from hidden Mahatmas. Scott-Elliot claimed to have obtained his through clairvoyant investigation. Steiner claimed to have read the Akashic records, a supposed cosmic library of all events that have ever occurred. For those who accept these claims, the scientific evidence is irrelevant. The spiritual truth of Lemuria is independent of its geological truth. For the cultural nationalist, truth is found in the traditions and heritage of a people. A claim is true if it affirms the dignity, antiquity, and worth of a civilization. Lemuria may be true by this standard for those who identify with the Kumari Kandam tradition. The claim that Tamil civilization originated on a lost continent affirms the greatness of Tamil culture, the antiquity of Tamil language, and the importance of Tamil identity. For those who find meaning and pride in this claim, the geological evidence is beside the point. The cultural truth of Lemuria is independent of its geological truth. These different conceptions of truth are not easily reconciled. The scientist, the mystic, and the cultural nationalist are operating with different epistemologies, different theories about what counts as knowledge and how it is obtained. They are, in a sense, speaking different languages, using the same words but meaning different things by them. This does not mean that all conceptions of truth are equally valid. I would argue, and I suspect most viewers of this documentary would agree, that scientific truth has a special status because it is testable, falsifiable, and self-correcting. When science says that Lemuria did not exist, this is not merely an opinion. It is a conclusion based on an overwhelming body of evidence gathered by thousands of researchers over more than a century. It can be checked, it can be verified, it can be challenged. And if new evidence were to appear that contradicted it, science would revise its conclusions. This is the strength of the scientific method, and it is why scientific claims deserve a different kind of respect than mystical revelations or cultural traditions. But it would be arrogant and short-sighted to dismiss the other forms of truth entirely. The mystic and the cultural nationalist are grasping at something real, not the reality of a sunken continent, but the reality of the human need for meaning, purpose, identity, and transcendence. These needs are as real as any geological formation, and they cannot be satisfied by seismic surveys and core samples. Science can tell us that Lemuria did not exist, but it cannot tell us why we want it to have existed. It cannot address the longing that the myth expresses. It cannot fill the void that the myth was created to fill. Let us now turn to a question that we have deferred until now, but that lies at the very heart of the Lemuria story. What, if anything, can we learn from this extraordinary episode in the history of human thought? The first lesson is about the nature of scientific progress. The story of Lemuria demonstrates how science works, how hypotheses are proposed, tested, and either confirmed or rejected in light of new evidence. Sclater's hypothesis was a good hypothesis. It was based on real evidence. It was internally consistent. It made testable predictions. And it was ultimately rejected because better evidence and a better theory came along. This is not a failure of science. This is science working exactly as it should. The ability to discard ideas that have been proved wrong, no matter how elegant, how popular, or how deeply cherished those ideas may be, is the greatest strength of the scientific method. The second lesson is about the power of myth. The story of Lemuria demonstrates how easily a scientific hypothesis can be transformed into a myth, and how once that transformation has occurred, the myth takes on a life of its own, independent of the science that gave birth to it. Blavatsky's Lemuria bears almost no resemblance to Sclater's Lemuria. The New Age Lemuria bears almost no resemblance to Blavatsky's Lemuria. The Kumari Kandam Lemuria bears almost no resemblance to any of them. Each version of the myth is shaped by the needs, values, and assumptions of the community that created it. The myth adapts, it evolves, it survives while the science dies. The third lesson is about the importance of critical thinking. The story of Lemuria is a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting claims without examining the evidence. It is easy to believe in Lemuria if you do not know the geological evidence against it. It is easy to accept Blavatsky's claims if you do not know that many of them were plagiarized from other sources and that she was caught fabricating evidence on multiple occasions. It is easy to be swept up in the romance of a lost continent if you do not stop to ask the basic question: what is the evidence? Critical thinking is not cynicism. It is not the refusal to believe anything. It is the commitment to believe things for good reasons, to proportion your belief to the evidence, to seek out disconfirming evidence as well as confirming evidence, and to be willing to change your mind when the evidence warrants it. The story of Lemuria shows what happens when critical thinking is abandoned, when people believe what they want to believe rather than what the evidence supports. The fourth lesson is about the human need for story. We are narrative creatures. We understand the world through stories. We find meaning through stories, we connect with each other through stories, and we are powerfully drawn to certain kinds of stories, stories of lost paradises, fallen heroes, hidden knowledge, and ultimate redemption. Lemuria is one of these stories. It is a story about a golden age that was lost and a wisdom that might yet be recovered. It is a story that resonates with deep structures in the human psyche, structures that have been expressed in myths and legends for as long as human beings have been telling stories. This does not mean we should accept the story as fact, but it does mean we should respect its power and understand its appeal. The hunger for meaning that drives people to believe in Lemuria is not a weakness. It is a fundamental human need. And if we want people to embrace science rather than myth, we need to recognize this need and find ways to address it. We need to show that the real story, the story told by geology, biology, and paleontology, is as grand, as meaningful, and as awe-inspiring as any myth, because it is. The fifth lesson, and perhaps the most important, is about intellectual humility. The scientists who proposed Lemuria in the 1860s were not fools. They were intelligent, well-educated, careful thinkers who reached a conclusion that was wrong. They were wrong not because they were stupid, but because they lacked information about plate tectonics, about isostasy, about the composition of the ocean floor that would not become available for another century. They did the best they could with the knowledge they had, and they were wrong. This should give us pause. If brilliant scientists in the 1860s could be wrong about something as fundamental as the existence of a continent, then perhaps we, too, are wrong about things we currently believe. Perhaps future generations will look back at our most cherished scientific theories and shake their heads, just as we shake our heads at the idea of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean. This is not an argument for believing in Lemuria. It is an argument for humility, for recognizing that our knowledge is always incomplete, that our theories are always provisional, and that the history of science is a history of ideas that seemed certain at the time but were later proved wrong. This is not cause for despair. It is cause for wonder. The universe is stranger, more complex, and more surprising than we currently imagine. There are discoveries waiting to be made that will transform our understanding of the world in ways we cannot predict. The real ocean floor may not contain a sunken continent, but it contains wonders enough to fill 1,000 lifetimes of investigation. And the real history of the Earth, the dance of continents, the evolution of life, the rise and fall of species, is a story so vast and so magnificent that no human myth can match it. Let us consider for a moment what the world would look like if Lemuria had actually existed. This is an exercise in imagination, but it is a useful one because it helps us understand just how dramatic and how consequential the existence of a sunken continent would be. If Lemuria had existed, if there had been a large continental landmass in the Indian Ocean that had sunk beneath the waves, the evidence would be everywhere. The floor of the Indian Ocean would be composed of continental crust, not oceanic crust. Seismic surveys would reveal the thick, light granitic rock characteristic of continents. Gravity measurements would show anomalies consistent with a large mass of continental material. Deep-sea drilling would bring up samples of continental rock, granite, gneiss, schist, rather than the basalt and sediment that is actually found. If an advanced civilization had existed on this continent, the evidence would be even more dramatic. We would find artifacts, tools, pottery, metalwork, building materials in the sediment on the ocean floor. We would find the remains of buildings and infrastructure. We would find evidence of agriculture, pollen from cultivated plants, the bones of domesticated animals. We would find evidence of writing, inscriptions, tablets, documents. We would find evidence of trade, goods from other regions, materials imported from distant lands. None of this evidence exists. Not a single piece of it. The floor of the Indian Ocean has been surveyed, sampled, drilled, and mapped in extraordinary detail, and not one shred of evidence for a sunken continent or an ancient civilization has ever been found. The absence of evidence in this case truly is evidence of absence. We have looked carefully, thoroughly, and systematically, and we have found nothing. This is not because the evidence is hidden or inaccessible. The floor of the Indian Ocean is not beyond the reach of modern technology. Deep-sea submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, sonar systems, and deep-sea drilling rigs have explored the ocean floor in detail. If there were a sunken continent down there, we would know about it. The fact that we do not know about it, the fact that no one has ever found any evidence of it, is the strongest possible indication that it does not exist. And yet, the myth persists. The dream refuses to die. The waters of the Indian Ocean close over a continent that never was, and people continue to believe in it, to write about it, to meditate upon it, to build communities around it. Why? Perhaps the answer lies not in the Indian Ocean, but in the human heart. Perhaps Lemuria is not really about a physical continent at all. Perhaps it is about something else, something deeper, something more personal, something that cannot be measured by seismic surveys or refuted by geological evidence. Perhaps Lemuria is about the sense that something has been lost, not a continent but a connection to nature, to each other, to the deeper dimensions of existence. In our modern, technological, fast-paced world, many people feel disconnected from the natural world which has been paved over and developed beyond recognition, disconnected from each other despite being more networked than ever before. Disconnected from meaning and purpose in a culture that values productivity and consumption above all else. Lemuria, in its modern incarnation, represents the opposite of this disconnection. It represents a time when humans were connected to nature, to each other, to the spiritual dimensions of reality. It represents a way of being that has been lost but might yet be recovered. It is not a place on a map. It is a state of consciousness. It is a vision of what humanity could be if it turned away from materialism and embraced a more holistic, more spiritual, more connected way of life. This interpretation of Lemuria is, I think, more honest and more useful than the literal belief in a sunken continent. It takes the emotional and spiritual content of the myth seriously while acknowledging that the physical claims are unsupported. It recognizes that the myth expresses real needs and real aspirations, even if the specific claims it makes are false. And it opens the door to a conversation about how those needs and aspirations might be addressed in ways that do not require us to abandon science or embrace pseudo-history. There is one more chapter in the Lemuria story that deserves attention, and it is a chapter that is still being written. This is the chapter about how the idea of Lemuria interacts with the broader contemporary landscape of alternative beliefs, conspiracy theories, and what is sometimes called the post-truth era. We live in a time when trust in institutions, scientific institutions, governmental institutions, media institutions, is at a historic low in many parts of the world. We live in a time when information and misinformation flow with equal ease through digital networks, when anyone with an internet connection can publish their ideas to a global audience, and when the traditional gatekeepers of knowledge, universities, peer-reviewed journals, established media outlets have lost much of their authority. In this environment, ideas like Lemuria flourish. They flourish because the barriers to their dissemination have been removed. A century ago, if you wanted to publish a book about Lemuria, you had to find a publisher willing to take a risk on a fringe topic. Today, you can self-publish on the internet and reach millions of readers. A century ago, if you wanted to find a community of fellow Lemuria believers, you had to join an organization like the Theosophical Society and attend meetings in person. Today, you can find thousands of like-minded people on social media, in online forums, and on video sharing platforms. The internet has democratized the production and consumption of knowledge and of pseudo-knowledge. This is both a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing because it allows voices that were previously marginalized to be heard. It is a curse because it allows claims that were previously marginalized to be spread without scrutiny, without fact-checking, and without the kind of critical evaluation that the scientific peer review process is designed to provide. Lemuria is just one of many alternative beliefs that have been amplified by the digital revolution. Flat Earth theory, anti-vaccination movements, ancient astronaut theories, and a host of other alternative narratives have all found new audiences and new energy online. These movements share common features: a distrust of mainstream institutions, a preference for personal experience over expert opinion, a sense of belonging to a community of truth seekers, and a belief that hidden knowledge is being suppressed by those in power. The challenge for science communication is not simply to refute these beliefs, though refutation is important, but to address the underlying needs that drive them. People who believe in Lemuria are not enemies of truth. They are seekers of truth who have, for various reasons, turned away from mainstream science and toward alternative sources of knowledge. If we want to bring them back, we need to understand why they left. We need to listen to their concerns, address their needs, and demonstrate that science can offer them what they are looking for: wonder, meaning, community, and autonomy, without requiring them to abandon evidence and reason. This is a difficult challenge. It requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to engage with people whose beliefs are very different from our own. It requires us to resist the temptation to mock, dismiss, or condescend. And it requires us to hold up the real story of the Earth, the story told by geology, biology, and physics, as a source of wonder and meaning that is at least as compelling as any myth, because the real story is compelling. The breakup of Gondwana, the drift of continents, the rise of the Himalayas, the evolution of lemurs in their island paradise, the slow dance of tectonic plates across the face of the Earth, this is a story of breathtaking scope and magnificence. It is a story that unfolds over billions of years, involving forces of unimaginable power and complexity. It is a story that connects every living thing on Earth to every other living thing, through the shared heritage of evolution and the shared platform of a dynamic, ever-changing planet. This story does not need embellishment. It does not need psychic giants or hidden masters or sunken civilizations. It is extraordinary enough as it is. And sharing this story, making it accessible, vivid, and emotionally resonant, is perhaps the best antidote to the myths that compete with it for our attention and our belief. Let us draw this journey to a close. We have traveled a long way, from Philip Sclater's paper on Madagascar's mammals in 1864 to the digital age of the 21st century. We have followed the idea of Lemuria through its many transformations, from scientific hypothesis to mystical homeland, from geological conjecture to spiritual symbol, from a proposed explanation for lemur distribution to a full-blown alternative history of humanity. Along the way, we have met some remarkable characters. Sclater, the careful zoologist who gave Lemuria its name. Haeckel, the passionate evolutionist who made it the cradle of humanity. Blavatsky, the charismatic mystic who populated it with psychic giants. Scott-Elliot, the clairvoyant theosophist who mapped its cities. Steiner, the philosopher who saw its fall as a necessary stage in spiritual evolution. Churchward, the fabulist who relocated it to the Pacific and renamed it Mu, and the Tamil scholars and cultural nationalists who found in Lemuria a confirmation of their own ancient traditions. We have examined the geological evidence and found it unambiguous. There was no continent in the Indian Ocean. The ocean floor is composed of oceanic crust. Continental crust does not sink. The distribution of lemurs is explained by the breakup of Gondwana and the drift of continents, not by a sunken land bridge. Plate tectonics has provided a complete and compelling explanation for all of the phenomena that Lemuria was originally invoked to explain. We have explored the psychological and social dimensions of the Lemurian myth. We have asked why people believe in lost continents and have identified several deep human needs, the need for wonder, meaning, community, and autonomy that such beliefs serve. We have considered the differences between scientific truth, mystical truth, and cultural truth, and we have argued that while scientific truth has a special status because of its testability and self-correcting nature, the other forms of truth express genuine and important human needs that deserve respect and engagement. And we have drawn lessons from the story, lessons about scientific progress, the power of myth, the importance of critical thinking, the human need for narrative, and the value of intellectual humility. The story of Lemuria is, in the end, a deeply human story. It is a story about our desire to understand the world and our place in it. It is a story about the power of imagination and the seduction of certainty. It is a story about the ways in which ideas travel across disciplinary boundaries, cultural boundaries, and temporal boundaries, transforming as they go and taking on meanings that their originators never intended. And it is a story about the ongoing tension between evidence and belief, between what we know and what we wish were true. Lemuria does not exist. It never existed. The waters of the Indian Ocean cover basalt and sediment, not the ruins of a lost civilization. The lemurs of Madagascar reached their island home not by walking across a sunken continent, but by the slow, majestic separation of the landmasses on which their ancestors lived. The history of humanity began not on a sunken paradise, but on the plains of Africa, where our earliest ancestors took their first upright steps millions of years ago. But the idea of Lemuria, the dream of Lemuria, that is another matter entirely. That idea exists. It is real. It has shaped science, shaped spirituality, shaped culture, and shaped millions of individual lives. It has inspired books and paintings and films and religious movements. It has given comfort to the grieving, purpose to the seeking, and identity to the dispossessed. It has been a mirror in which different communities have seen their own hopes, fears, and aspirations reflected. The idea of Lemuria tells us nothing about the floor of the Indian Ocean. But it tells us a great deal about the depths of the human mind, and those depths are in their own way as vast, as dark, as mysterious, and as full of wonder as any ocean. We began this journey with a question about lemurs, small, wide-eyed, nocturnal primates clinging to the branches of Madagascan forests. Let us end it with them, because in a strange and beautiful way, the lemurs are the truest part of the Lemuria story. They are real. They exist. They have been evolving on their island home for tens of millions of years, diversifying into dozens of species, filling ecological niches, developing remarkable adaptations, and living their quiet, ancient lives in the forests of Madagascar. The lemurs do not know that they gave their name to a lost continent. They do not know that their existence on Madagascar puzzled Victorian zoologists, inspired a scientific hypothesis, and sparked one of the most elaborate mythological traditions of the modern age. They do not know that people have written books, founded religions, and built entire worldviews around the mystery of how they got to their island. They do not need to know. They are busy being lemurs, climbing trees, eating fruit, singing their eerie calls across the forest canopy, raising their young and living their lives in the same forests where their ancestors lived millions of years before any human being existed to wonder about them. The lemurs are the real legacy of Lemuria, not the psychic giants, not the sunken cities, not the root races or the third eye or the Mahatmas or the Akashic records. The lemurs, small, furry, wide-eyed, wonderfully real, they are the evidence. They are the puzzle, they are the answer, and they are the reminder that the real world, the world of evolution and plate tectonics and island biogeography, is stranger, more beautiful, and more worthy of our wonder than any myth we have ever created. The continent of Lemuria does not lie beneath the Indian Ocean. But the story of Lemuria, the story of how a scientific hypothesis became a cosmic myth, and how that myth continues to shape human thought and culture to this day, that story is one of the most remarkable and most revealing chapters in the entire history of the human imagination. And the Indian Ocean rolls on, vast, ancient, indifferent to our myths, keeping its real secrets. The tectonic plates grind beneath it, carrying continents on their slow journey across the face of the earth. The mid-ocean ridges pour forth new rock, building new ocean floor that will endure for millions of years before being recycled back into the mantle. The sediment drifts down, layer upon layer, burying the basalt under a blanket of microscopic shells and particles of dust. And far above the ocean's surface, in the clear night air above Madagascar, a lemur stares into the darkness with enormous eyes, and the world turns and the story goes on. There are mysteries enough in the real world to fill 1,000 lifetimes. We do not need to invent new ones, but if the story of Lemuria teaches us anything, it is that we will always try. We will always reach beyond the known into the unknown, beyond the proven into the imagined, beyond the world as it is into the world as we wish it were. This is our gift and our burden, the restless, insatiable human imagination, forever building worlds that never were and never will be, forever dreaming of lands beneath the waves. Lemuria is gone, it was never here, but we the dreamers, the seekers, the storytellers, the scientists, we are here. And as long as we are here, the dream of Lemuria will never truly die, because Lemuria is not a continent, it is an idea. And ideas, unlike continents, do not sink, they float. They drift, they travel across oceans of time and space, carried by the currents of human thought, washing up on the shores of new minds and new ages, transformed but never destroyed. The water's close, the story ends, but the dreaming goes on.